Welcome, my friends. In today's video, we're going to step back more than 2,000 years and wander through the streets of Rome itself. Together, we'll trace the rise of a tiny city on the Tiber River, see how it transformed into a republic built on ambition and ideals, and watch it grow into the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. We'll meet its heroes and its villains, its builders and its destroyers, and uncover the triumphs and tragedies that shaped Rome's destiny. But before you get comfortable, make sure you've hit that subscribe button, and I want you to drop your city name and your local time down in the comments, so we'll know exactly where in the world you're joining us from. Imagine this. The year is somewhere around the 8th century BCE. Italy is not the Italy you know today. It's not pasta, not the Colosseum, not Vespers zipping through narrow streets. Back then, it was a patchwork of tribes, hills, forests, and small settlements where people lived in huts made of wood and mud. The Tiber River wound lazily through the land, and the 7 hills around it weren't yet crowned with marble temples. They were just hills. Ordinary, quiet, earthy. But in this seemingly ordinary place, something extraordinary was about to begin. And like all good stories, the Romans didn't start their history with a boring list of dates and farming practices. No, they started with a myth. A wild, dramatic, bloody myth that could rival any blockbuster series you've watched. Enter Romulus and Remus. Now, depending on who's telling the story, these two twins are either the brave founders of Rome or a pair of troublemakers dumped by fate into one of history's strangest origin tales. Their story begins with betrayal, a river, and of course, a she-wolf. The legend goes like this. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin, supposed to be chaste, pure, untouched. But somehow, she ended up pregnant, and not just with anyone's children. According to the tale, the father was none other than Mars, the god of war himself, which honestly explains a lot about the twins' future personalities. The problem was, their great-uncle, King Amulius, was not thrilled about this divine surprise. He feared that these babies would grow up and challenge him for the throne. So, like every paranoid tyrant in every story ever, he tried to get rid of them. He ordered the infants thrown into the river Tiber. But fate, apparently, had a different plan. The river didn't drown them, it carried them. They washed ashore near the foot of the Palatine Hill, where they were discovered by a she-wolf. Yes, you heard that right. A wolf. And not just any wolf. This motherly beast supposedly nursed the babies, kept them alive, and raised them until a shepherd named Faustulus found them. It's one of those moments in history where you stop and think, did this really happen? The Romans themselves weren't overly concerned with that. For them, the myth wasn't about accuracy, it was about identity. Fast forward a few years. Romulus and Remus grew into strong, ambitious young men. Eventually, the inevitable happened. They decided to found a city of their own. But where exactly should this new city stand? That's when the brothers had their first real falling out. Romulus preferred the Palatine Hill. Remus favored the Aventine. Being practical and very Roman about it, they turned to augury, the art of interpreting the will of the gods through birds. Long story short, both claimed the gods were on their side. Tempers flared. Words were exchanged. And then, in an act that set the tone for Roman politics for centuries to come, Romulus killed Remus. Some say Romulus stabbed him, others claim he struck him down in anger. But the point is clear. Rome was founded in blood. The new city would bear Romulus's name, Roma. It sounds brutal, doesn't it? But the Romans actually loved this story. To them, it was fitting that their city was born from conflict, ambition, and sacrifice. They weren't about fairy tales or peaceful shepherds singing in meadows. They were about grit, about taking what they wanted, about destiny, even if destiny came with a dagger. And that's how Rome's story begins. Not with peace, but with struggle. Now, once Romulus had the city, there was one big problem. Rome was a city without women. Imagine a wild camp of young men, ambitious and rowdy, but with no future generation to carry on the city's legacy. So Romulus came up with a plan. And let me tell you, it wasn't exactly a romantic one. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a grand festival. There was food, music, games, basically a huge party. The Sabines, unsuspecting, brought their families along. At the signal, the Romans seized the Sabine women and carried them off. History remembers this as the rape of the Sabine women, though the word rape here in Latin, raptio, meant abduction. Not always what we think of today. Still, it was violent, shocking, and very Roman. Now here's the strange twist. The Sabine women themselves eventually intervened to stop the bloodshed that followed. They stood between their Sabine families and their new Roman husbands and begged for peace. They argued that now they belonged to both sides, as daughters of Sabines and mothers of Romans. Through them, the two peoples merged, and Rome grew, stronger. It's one of those stories where you can't quite decide if it's horrifying, impressive, or both. But what's important is this. From its earliest days, Rome defined itself through inclusion. It didn't matter where you came from. If you were willing to become Roman, you could be part of the city. And that open-door policy, mixed with a little violence of course, would become one of the secrets of Rome's success. So let's pause here for a moment. Imagine you're a Roman centuries later, telling this story by the fire. You're not embarrassed that your city started with murder and kidnapping. On the contrary, you're proud of it. For the Romans, hardship wasn't something to hide. It was the very proof of their strength. To them, Rome's bloody beginnings were a badge of honor. Romulus himself went on to rule as Rome's first king. According to legend, he reigned for about 37 years. He organized the army, established laws, and laid the foundations for Roman political life. Eventually, he disappeared mysteriously. Some say he was torn apart by angry senators. Others claim he ascended into the heavens and became the god Quirinus. Only in Rome could your career path take you from wolf-raised orphan to king to literal god. And with that, Rome had begun. A city carved out of hills and riverbanks, built by ambition, fueled by myth, and destined for greatness. What makes this chapter of Rome's story so fascinating isn't just the details of the myth, it's the attitude behind it. Other cultures in antiquity often imagined their founders as peaceful, wise figures chosen by the gods. The Romans, they imagined a fratricidal warlord with divine blood who built his city on theft, conflict, and determination. That's the Roman. Brand right there. Tough, unyielding, unapologetic. And yet behind the blood and legend, you can sense a deeper truth. Rome really did start as a tiny settlement along the Tiber, vulnerable to its stronger neighbors. To survive, it had to be scrappy. It had to be ruthless. It had to be Roman. This was just the spark, the flicker of a fire that would one day blaze into one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. When most people think of Rome, they picture emperors, Caesar, Augustus, Nero, all those guys strutting around in togas. But before Rome was an empire, and even before it was a republic, it was ruled by kings. Yes, kings. 7 of them, if you believe Roman tradition. And let me tell you, each of these kings had a story that sounds less like a dusty history book and more like an ancient Netflix series. So let's rewind to the period right after Romulus founded the city. Picture Rome. It's still small, more like a fortified village than a sprawling metropolis. Mud huts, wooden fences, not a marble column in sight. The people were rough, the food was simple, and the Tiber River was their lifeline. Rome was not yet the shining capital of the ancient world. It was a toddler learning to walk. And its babysitters? These kings. Romulus, the founder who became a god. We left off with Romulus, the first king. He wasn't just a figurehead. He organized Rome's early government, divided the people into tribes, and created the Senate, a council of elders who would eventually become the backbone of Roman politics. But Romulus was also a warrior king. He spent much of his reign fighting neighbors, expanding Rome's territory, and making sure nobody forgot who was boss. He ruled for about 4 decades before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Some say a thunderstorm whisked him away, to heaven, where he became the god Quirinus. Others whisper that the senators got tired of him and hacked him to pieces. Either way, Rome had its first taste of political drama, something that would become a national pastime. Numa Pompilius, the peaceful king after Romulus, Rome got a completely different vibe with its second king, Numa Pompilius. If Romulus was the sword, Numa was the scroll. He was a Sabine by origin. Remember the Sabines from chapter 1. This was Rome already practicing its outsider can become Roman policy. Numa wasn't into war. He was into wisdom. He gave Rome its religious institutions, rituals, and priesthoods. Many of Rome's most famous traditions, like the Vestal Virgins, the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, and sacred festivals, were credited to him. While Romulus made Rome strong, Numa gave it a soul. Think about it. Even the toughest warriors need a little ritual and ceremony to feel like they're part of something bigger. Numa gave Rome that sense of order, convincing his people that the gods weren't just watching, they were guiding. Under him, Rome traded battles for prayers, at least for a while. Tullus Hostilius, the warrior who couldn't sit still. Of course, peace never lasts forever. Along came Tullus Hostilius, Rome's third king, and he was basically Romulus 2.0. Tullus thought Numa had made the Romans too soft, so he revved things back up with wars, duels, and conquests. One of the most famous stories from his reign is the battle between the Hieraci and the Curiati, two sets of triplet brothers, one Roman and one Alban, chosen to fight to the death to settle a war between Rome and Alba Longa. Talk about sibling rivalry taken to the extreme. Tullus expanded Rome's territory and power, but he didn't have Numa's respect for religion. That, according to Roman legend, was his downfall. He supposedly angered Jupiter by botching a sacred ritual and was struck down by lightning. Lesson learned: you can swing a sword all you like, but don't mess up when calling on the gods. Ancus Marcius, the builder. King next up was Ancus Marcius, Rome's fourth king and the grandson of Numa. You could say he was the middle ground between Numa and Tullus, a man of both war and peace. Ancus was practical. He believed Rome needed more than battles and prayers. It needed infrastructure. He built the first bridge across the Tiber, expanded the city's territory to the coast, and founded the port of Ostia, Rome's gateway to the Mediterranean. Imagine that, a small settlement suddenly gaining access to the sea. Trade, fishing, salt. This was big. Ancus also fortified Rome with new walls and encouraged settlement of conquered peoples inside the city. You can see how Rome was evolving, slowly but surely becoming more than just a war camp. It was turning into a community with real staying power. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first Etruscan king. Now things start to get interesting. Rome's fifth king, Tarquin the Elder, or Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, wasn't even Roman by birth. He was Etruscan, from the wealthy and powerful civilization just north of Rome. The Etruscans were sophisticated. They had advanced architecture, fancy religious rituals, and a knack for ruling. Tarquin the Elder brought that sophistication to Rome. He's credited with beginning major construction projects, like the Circus Maximus, where chariot races would later thrill crowds of thousands. He also boosted Rome's military and doubled the Senate. Under him, Rome began looking less like a scrappy hill town and more like a serious city. But his reign ended violently. Court rivals arranged his assassination, and suddenly the throne was left in the hands of his clever wife, Tanaquil. She pulled a political masterstroke by installing their son-in-law, Servius Tullius, as king. Servius Tullius, the people's king Servius Tullius, was perhaps the most remarkable of Rome's early kings. According to legend, he was born a slave. But fate, or maybe just good luck, favored him. One story says his head caught fire while he was a child, but he wasn't harmed, which everyone took as a sign he was destined for greatness. As king, Servius transformed Rome's society. He organized the people based on wealth, creating classes that determined military duty and voting power. Rich men provided better equipment, so they got more political clout. Poor men gave less, so their influence shrank. It was practical, if not exactly fair, and it shaped Roman politics for centuries. He also expanded the city, building the Servian Wall, which protected Rome for hundreds of years. Servius was popular with the people, but less so with the elite. And in Rome, that usually spelled trouble. Tarquinius Superbus, the last king. And then we come to Tarquin the Proud, Rome's seventh and final king. If there's one guy who lived up to his nickname, it's him. Arrogant, ruthless, and power-hungry, Tarquin ruled not as a leader, but as a tyrant. He ignored the Senate, relied on fear, and even seized power by murdering his father-in-law, Servius. His reign was marked by massive building projects, like finishing the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, but also by cruelty. He forced labor on his subjects, ruled with an iron fist, and made more enemies than friends. The breaking point came with the infamous story of Lucretia, a noblewoman assaulted by Tarquin's son. Lucretia's tragic death sparked outrage, and the Romans rose up in fury. They expelled Tarquin, vowing never again to be ruled by a king. In 509 BCE, Rome declared itself a republic, and just like that, the Age of Kings ended. From kings to republic. Looking back, the seven kings of Rome might feel like myths stitched together with a bit of truth. Historians debate whether they really existed, or whether they're legendary stand-ins for Rome's slow evolution from a village to a city. But for Romans themselves, the kings were essential to their identity. Each one represented a stage of growth. Romulus gave Rome its name and bloodline. Numa gave it religion. Tullus gave it war. Ancus gave it trade and walls. Tarquin the Elder gave it grandeur. Servius gave it structure. Tarquin the Proud gave it tyranny and a reason to rebel. The Romans loved the story of their kings, but they loved even more the fact that they overthrew them. From then on, they would swear, no more kings. They were a people who valued freedom. Well, at least freedom for themselves. And so, out of monarchy's ashes, Rome stepped into its next great experiment, the Republic. When the Romans finally got rid of their last king, they didn't just slam the door on monarchy, they bolted it shut, nailed it, and swore never to let it open again. Kings were out, forever. But here's the thing, throwing out a king is one thing. Replacing him with something that actually works is another. Rome had to invent a brand new way of running itself. And what they came up with was the Republic, a system that would carry them for nearly 500 years and lay the foundation for everything we think of when we hear the word Roman. At the heart of the Republic was an obsession with balance. The Romans had seen what happened when one man had too much power. Tarquinius Superbus had made sure of that. So they designed a system where power was deliberately split, like a pie cut into thin slices, so no single person could eat it all. Instead of one king, Rome got two consuls. These consuls were elected officials who ruled together, each one keeping an eye on the other, and their term lasted just a single year. Imagine running a country where your leader has less job security than the host of a reality TV show. That was the point. Short terms, constant accountability, and above all, no kings. But consuls weren't the only piece of the puzzle. The Senate, which had started as a council of elders under Romulus, now became the real powerhouse of Rome. Made up mostly of wealthy aristocrats from old families, the Senate claimed to be the wise guiding hand of the Republic. They didn't technically make laws. That was for the assemblies of the people. But their advice was so influential that it was almost impossible to ignore. If the consuls were the drivers, the Senate was the backseat driver with the map, constantly reminding them which way to turn. Now the assemblies were where ordinary Romans came in, or at least in theory. Citizens could gather, debate, and vote on laws and magistrates. It sounds democratic, and in some ways, it was. But Rome wasn't exactly a modern democracy. Wealth and status still mattered, and the rich had louder voices. Still, it was something. new in the ancient world, a system where citizens, not kings, had a say. The early republic wasn't smooth sailing. In fact, it was rocky from the start. The biggest issue was the division between the patricians and the plebeians. Patricians were the old aristocratic families, the big names, the elites, the people who traced their bloodlines back to the very founding of the city. Plebeians, on the other hand, were everyone else. Farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, shopkeepers. They made up the majority, but they didn't have much political power. And as you can imagine, that didn't sit well for long. The plebeians began to push back. They were the backbone of the army. Rome couldn't fight without them. And if there was one thing the Romans were always doing, it was fighting. So the plebeians had leverage. Around the early 5th century BCE, they staged what's known as the first secession of the plebs. Basically, they went on strike. They marched out of the city, set up camp on a nearby hill, and said, "Good luck running Rome without us." It was a bold move, and it worked. The patricians, realizing they couldn't defend Rome alone, had to compromise. Out of this came one of the Republic's most important offices, the tribunes of the plebs. These officials were elected by plebeians to protect their interests. Tribunes had real power. They could veto laws, block actions by magistrates, and defend the rights of ordinary citizens. And here's the kicker: their bodies were considered sacred. Anyone who harmed a tribune could be killed without punishment. That's how serious Rome was about protecting this new balance. The struggle between patricians and plebeians, often called the conflict of the orders, went on for centuries. It wasn't a one-time deal. It was a long, messy negotiation about rights, laws, and social standing. Over time, the plebeians gained more and more ground. They won the right to have their own assembly, the concilium plebis, whose decisions eventually became binding for all Romans. They demanded and got access to higher offices, including the consulship itself, and they insisted on written laws, so the elites couldn't keep all the rules in their heads and twist them as they pleased. That demand for written laws led to the creation of the 12 Tables, around 450 BCE. These were Rome's first set of codified laws, carved into bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum for everyone to see. Were they perfect? Not at all. They included things like harsh punishments for debt and bizarre rules about family life. But they were a step toward fairness, and more importantly, they were visible. No more secret laws whispered in back rooms. Now every citizen could know their rights, at least in theory. While all this political drama was unfolding at home, Rome was busy fending off enemies abroad. And in those early centuries, Rome wasn't yet the unstoppable juggernaut it would become. It was just one small player among many in Italy, surrounded by powerful neighbors. The Etruscans still loomed in the north, the Latins and other tribes competed for land, and the Samnites, a fierce, mountain people, clashed with Rome again and again. Every year seemed to bring another war, another battle, another test of survival. What made Rome different was how it handled victory. Most ancient cities, when they beat their enemies, either wiped them out or enslaved them. Rome did that too, sometimes, but it also had another trick. It absorbed people. Conquered communities could be granted different levels of citizenship. Some got full Roman rights, others partial, but all were tied into Rome's system. This approach built loyalty, or at least dependence, and over time, it gave Rome a larger pool of soldiers and resources than its rivals. By the 4th century BCE, Rome was expanding steadily. It crushed the Latin League, fought off the Etruscans, and even defeated the Samnites in a series of brutal wars. Each victory added new allies, new citizens, new lands. Rome was turning into the dominant power of central Italy, and then came the Gauls. Around 390 BCE, a tribe of Gauls swept down from the north and did the unthinkable. They sacked Rome. Imagine the shock. The invincible city, the rising star of Italy, humiliated by barbarian raiders. The Romans never forgot it. For centuries afterward, the word Gaul would make their skin crawl. But Rome had a way of turning disaster into determination. The Bad sack of Rome lit a fire under them. They rebuilt stronger, fortified their city, and sharpened their military machine. If Rome had been tough before, after the Gauls, it was iron. What's remarkable about the early Republic is how much of Rome's later identity was already visible. The distrust of one-man rule, the constant push and pull between classes, the relentless warfare, the willingness to adapt, absorb, and reinvent itself after defeat. These weren't accidents. They were baked into the DNA of the Republic from the very beginning. By the time the 3rd century BCE rolled around, Rome wasn't just a city anymore. It was the master of most of Italy, a republic hardened by centuries of struggle at home and abroad. But even as it grew stronger, it was about to face challenges that would push it far beyond anything it had known before. Because across the sea, in the glittering harbors of North Africa, there was another power rising. A city every bit as ambitious, wealthy, and cunning as Rome. A city named Carthage. And when Rome and Carthage collided, the world would never be the same again. When the Romans looked across the Mediterranean in the 3rd century BCE, they saw more than waves and distant shores. They saw a rival, a shadowy reflection of themselves in another great city, Carthage. Carthage was everything Rome feared and admired at the same time: rich, powerful, cunning, and ambitious. While Rome was built on grit, discipline, and soldiers in muddy sandals, Carthage thrived on trade, wealth, and a vast navy. If Rome was a wolf, Carthage was a shark, gliding through the waters of the Mediterranean, sleek and dangerous. And inevitably, those two predators were bound to clash. The spark came, as it so often does, from somewhere small. Sicily, that triangular island just at the toe of Italy's boot, was the perfect prize. Fertile land, strategic harbors, and right at the crossroads of East and West. Rome had interests there, Carthage had interests there, and neither side wanted to share. What started as a local quarrel escalated into something far bigger: the First Punic War. Now, here's the funny part. Rome, at this point, didn't have a navy. They were land fighters, soldiers who knew how to march, dig trenches, and bash enemies with shields. Carthage, on the other hand, had the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. You'd think the Romans wouldn't stand a chance at sea, but the Romans had this uncanny ability to adapt. They captured a Carthaginian ship, studied it, and then built copies by the dozens. And since they weren't naturally skilled sailors, they invented a clever device called the corvus, a boarding plank with a spike that could be dropped onto enemy ships. Basically, they turned naval battles into land battles on water, something they were much better at. It was like saying, "Fine, if we can't sail like you, we'll just bring the fight to our turf." The First Punic War dragged on for over 20 years. Imagine that. An entire generation growing up under the shadow of the conflict. Battles were fought on land and sea, fortunes were lost, fleets were sunk, but slowly, Rome's persistence wore Carthage down. By 241 BCE, Carthage admitted defeat. Rome gained control of Sicily, its very first overseas province. For the first time, Rome wasn't just an Italian power, it was a Mediterranean power. And Carthage, well, Carthage was humiliated, but not destroyed. And that humiliation was like a splinter festering under the skin. Carthage licked its wounds, rebuilt its wealth through trade, and bided its time. And into this simmering atmosphere of resentment stepped a man whose name would echo through history: Hannibal Barca. Hannibal grew up hating Rome. There's even a story that as a child, his father made him swear an oath to never be a friend to the Romans. Whether that's true or not, it captures the spirit of the man. Hannibal was brilliant, fearless, and utterly relentless. And he was the architect of Rome's darkest nightmare, the Second Punic War. When Hannibal made his move, in 218 BCE, he didn't do it in the obvious way. He didn't sail across the sea to attack Italy. He did something so bold that even today, it feels like a scene out of a movie. He marched his army, complete with cavalry, mercenaries, and even war elephants, across Spain, through Gaul, and over the Alps to invade Italy from the north. Think about that for a moment. Crossing the Alps with elephants. The mountains were icy, treacherous, filled with hostile tribes, and his men suffered horribly. Many died along the way, but Hannibal made it through. And when he descended into Italy, Rome was shocked. For years, Hannibal rampaged across the Italian peninsula, winning victory after victory. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, he smashed Roman armies. Cannae was a masterpiece of tactics. Hannibal lured the Romans into battle, let them push into the center of his line, then closed in from all sides. The result was a massacre, tens of thousands of Romans cut down in a single day. It was one of the worst defeats in Rome's history, and for a moment, it looked like Hannibal might actually bring the Republic to its knees. But here's where the Roman character showed itself. Any other power might have surrendered after such disasters. Rome didn't. The Senate refused to negotiate. Citizens swore oaths to keep fighting. New armies were raised, often from boys barely old enough to hold a sword. Rome endured loss after loss, but it never broke. It was like punching a wall. The wall cracked, but it never fell. Hannibal waited for reinforcements from Carthage that never came. His strategy was brilliant, but Carthage hesitated, and Rome slowly recovered. Eventually, a Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, took the war to Carthage itself. While Hannibal was still in Italy, Scipio sailed to North Africa, forcing Carthage to call Hannibal back to defend the homeland. The two titans met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Hannibal was still brilliant, but Scipio had learned from Rome's mistakes. He countered Hannibal's tactics and won. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage defeated again, stripped of its empire, and forced to pay crippling reparations. Rome, meanwhile, was transformed. The victory over Hannibal wasn't just another win. It was proof that Rome was unstoppable. Other powers began to take notice. Greece, the rich and cultured land of philosophers and temples, found itself facing Roman legions. One by one, the Greek states fell under Roman influence. Macedon, once ruled by Alexander's descendants, was humbled. Rome was no longer just an Italian power, or even a Mediterranean one. It was becoming a world power. But Carthage still existed, and to many Romans, that was intolerable. The senator Cato the Elder famously ended his speeches with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." It became an obsession. And in 149 BCE, Rome launched the Third Punic War. By now, Carthage was weakened, a shadow of its former self. Still, the city resisted fiercely. For 3 years, the Romans laid siege, battering at its walls, until finally, in 146 BCE, Carthage fell. The Romans burned it to the ground, enslaved the survivors, and, according to later legend, salted the earth, so nothing would grow again. It was total destruction, the final act of vengeance. And yet, in that same year, Rome also crushed Corinth, a great Greek city, bringing Greece firmly under its control. 146 BCE became a turning point, a year when Rome stood alone as the dominant power of the Mediterranean. No rival was left. Carthage was gone, Greece was subdued, and Rome's legions stood victorious. But victory came with consequences. With new provinces pouring wealth into the Republic, Rome began to change. Vast riches flowed in from conquered lands, filling the pockets of generals and senators. Ordinary farmers, the backbone of Rome, started to struggle as cheap grain from abroad undercut them. Slaves captured in war flooded the economy, changing the dynamics of labor. And with power came corruption, ambition, and rivalry. Rome had conquered the world, but now it faced a new challenge: conquering itself. The Punic Wars had shown Rome's strength, its resilience, and its ferocity, but they had also sown the seeds of inequality and division that would one day threaten the very system the Romans had fought so hard to defend. For the moment, though, Rome basked in its triumph. The wolf cub, born on the banks of the Tiber, had not only survived, it had grown into a predator that ruled the Mediterranean. But as the Republic swelled with power, the question lingered. How long could this balance last before it tipped into chaos? Rome had crushed Carthage, humbled Greece, and declared itself master of the Mediterranean. But victory, as the Romans soon learned, can be as dangerous as defeat. The legions had returned with treasure, slaves, and glory, but the balance that kept the Republic steady began to crack. Success had changed Rome, and not always for the better. The wolf had grown fat, and now it had to deal with hunger it couldn't control. The old Republic had been built on farmers, citizen soldiers who owned small plots of land, fought in wars, and then returned home to till their fields. But after years of endless campaigns abroad, many of those farmers came home to find their land ruined or sold off. Some had been gone too long. Others couldn't compete with cheap grain flooding in from conquered provinces, and many simply lost everything. Their farms were swallowed up by the wealthy elites, who built vast estates called latifundia, worked by slaves captured in Rome's wars. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the old backbone of the Republic, the independent farmer, began to collapse. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a political one. Rome prided itself on being a republic of citizens, not subjects. But what happens when those citizens lose their land, their livelihoods, and their voices? They drift into the city, swelling the population of Rome itself. Crowds of unemployed men packed the streets, living on handouts and hoping for work, easy prey for ambitious politicians who promised them bread in exchange for loyalty. Enter the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. They came from a noble family, but they looked around at the misery of the plebeians and decided something had to change. Tiberius, the elder, became a tribune in 133 BCE and proposed land reforms. His plan was simple: limit the amount of land any one person could hold and redistribute the excess to poor citizens. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was dangerous, because it threatened the wealth of the most powerful senators. Tiberius pushed his law through anyway, defying tradition, bending rules, and rallying the people. For a while, it seemed like he might actually succeed in leveling the scales. But Rome's elites weren't about to let their estates be carved up without a fight. Tiberius was eventually clubbed to death in the streets by a mob of senators and their supporters. The first blood spilled in Rome's internal political battles. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius tried again. He expanded his brother's reforms, pushed for grain subsidies to feed the poor, and proposed giving more rights to Rome's Italian allies. But he too ran afoul of the Senate. His reforms threatened the established order, and once again, violence followed. Surrounded by enemies, Gaius took his own life rather than fall into their hands. The deaths of the Gracchi were a turning point. They showed that in Rome, politics had become a battlefield. Disagreements were no longer settled by debate or compromise. They were settled with blood. The Republic had tasted civil strife, and it would only get worse. Meanwhile, Rome's military system was also changing. Traditionally, only land-owning citizens could serve as soldiers. But with so many poor Romans losing their farms, that pool of eligible men shrank. Enter Gaius Marius, a general who changed everything. In 107 BCE, Marius opened the army to the landless poor. These men, desperate for pay and plunder, signed up in droves. For them, the army wasn't about civic duty, it was about survival. This reform solved one problem, but created another. Soldiers were now more loyal to their generals, who promised them land and rewards, than to the state itself. Armies became personal power bases, and ambitious commanders realized they could use their legions not just to fight Rome's enemies, but to fight Rome itself. The first man to test this was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He was a patrician, a brilliant, but ruthless general who clashed with Marius over command of a lucrative war against Mithridates in the east. When the Senate tried to strip Sulla of his command and give it to Marius instead, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome, soldiers storming their own capital, something that had once been unthinkable in the Republic, was now reality. Sulla seized power, declared himself dictator, and purged his enemies in a reign of terror. Lists of proscribed men were posted in the forum, names of those condemned to death, their property seized, their families ruined. It was state-sanctioned murder, and it sent a chilling message. In Rome, politics was now war by other means. Eventually, Sulla stepped down, boasting that he had restored order, but the damage was done. Once the line of marching on Rome had been crossed, it could never be uncrossed. While Rome tore itself apart, its empire kept growing. Conquests brought new provinces, more wealth, more slaves, and more problems. The gap between rich and poor widened, corruption flourished, and the Senate seemed increasingly out of touch. Ambitious men looked at the Republic not as a shared system to protect, but as a ladder to climb. Among those ambitious men were three names that would dominate the late Republic: Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Pompey was the brilliant general who cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and won glory in the East. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, a master of deals and schemes. And Caesar, well, Caesar was something else entirely. Charming, daring, calculating, and willing to gamble everything for power. Together, these three formed the so-called First Triumvirate, an informal alliance to dominate Roman politics. It wasn't an official office, but it worked for a while. They balanced each other out, each bringing something to the table. But alliances in Rome were always temporary, held together by ambition and convenience, not trust. Even before the triumvirate, Rome had been shaken by rebellion. The most famous came from an unlikely source, a gladiator named Spartacus. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and his followers broke out of a gladiator school in Capua and sparked a massive slave uprising. For 2 years, they defeated Roman armies, raided the countryside, and terrified the Republic. Spartacus wasn't just fighting for freedom. He was fighting against the entire system that kept Rome's economy running. Eventually, the rebellion was crushed. Tens of thousands of slaves were killed, and 6,000 were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning. Rome had survived, but the revolt exposed the cracks in its foundations. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Republic was groaning under the weight of its own contradictions. It was a system built for a city-state, now trying to manage a global empire. Senators squabbled over power while generals commanded legions more loyal to them than to Rome. Ordinary citizens were caught in the middle, struggling with poverty and inequality. Violence was becoming the language of politics, and the shadow of civil war loomed larger with every passing year. Rome was still the master of the Mediterranean, still rich, still powerful, but inside, the Republic was crumbling. The ideals of shared power and civic duty were being replaced by greed, ambition, and bloodshed. And standing at the heart of this storm was Julius Caesar, a man who would either save the Republic or bury it once and for all. The Republic was broken, though few admitted it openly. Senators still wore their togas, still debated in the forum, still clung to the rituals that had defined Rome for centuries. But beneath the marble and ceremony, power no longer lay in words or votes. It lay in armies and in the men who commanded them. The Republic had become a stage for ambition, and Julius Caesar was about to seize the starring role. Caesar was no stranger to danger. Born into an old patrician family, but without much wealth, he learned early that charm and boldness could open doors that money could not. He dressed sharply, spoke with charisma, and surrounded himself with allies. He borrowed money recklessly, but always with confidence that fortune would follow him. And in Rome, confidence was often more valuable than coin. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus gave him his first great leap. With their support, Caesar secured the consulship in 59 BCE. In office, he pushed through laws that benefited his allies and rewarded his supporters, ignoring senatorial outrage. But Caesar was not content to be just another politician. He wanted glory, the kind only a general could win. When his consulship ended, he secured a command in Gaul, and it was there that Caesar's legend was forged. The conquest of Gaul was brutal. For nearly a decade, Caesar led his legions through forests, rivers, and mountains, battling tribes who fought fiercely for their freedom. He wrote his own accounts of the war, sending reports back to Rome that painted him as brilliant, daring, and unstoppable. He did not hide the bloodshed, but he framed it as Rome's destiny, civilization triumphing over barbarism. Millions read his words, and Caesar became not just a general, but a celebrity. By the time he was finished, Gaul was under Roman control, and Caesar had an army hardened by victory and loyal to him personally. He was immensely rich from plunder, adored by the people, and feared by the Senate. But the Republic had little room for men who grew too powerful. Crassus was dead, killed in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians, and Pompey had drifted closer to the Senate, uneasy with Caesar's rising star. The alliance had shattered. Now Rome faced a choice: Caesar or Pompey. The Senate, siding with Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. For Caesar, this was more than a command. It was a death sentence. Without his army, he would be vulnerable to his enemies, tried for his defiance, and likely ruined. He hesitated at the border of Italy, standing at the banks of the Rubicon River. To cross it with his army was treason. To refuse was surrender. Caesar, never one for half measures, chose treason. The die is cast, he supposedly said, and he marched on Rome. The city panicked. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, leaving Rome in Caesar's hands. Civil war had begun. Caesar pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, moving with breathtaking speed, rallying allies, and defeating enemy forces. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, the two titans finally clashed. Caesar's outnumbered legions crushed Pompey's forces. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge, but instead found betrayal. The young pharaoh Ptolemy III, hoping to please Caesar, had Pompey murdered. His severed head was presented to Caesar, who wept at the sight of his former ally and rival brought so low. Caesar lingered in Egypt, entangled in the country's own civil war. There he met Cleopatra, the brilliant and ambitious queen, and together they forged both a political alliance and a personal bond. Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Caesarion, and for a time, Caesar seemed as much a kingmaker in Alexandria as he was a ruler in Rome. But the Republic still demanded his attention, and war still raged. One by one, Caesar crushed his enemies. In North Africa, in Spain, across the Mediterranean, he defeated the remnants of Pompey's supporters. His victories were swift, decisive, and absolute. By 46 BCE, he returned to Rome not as a general seeking power, but as a master who already held it. The Senate named him dictator, first for a term of years, and then, eventually, for life. For some, Caesar was a savior. He launched reforms, he restructured debt, reformed the calendar, and expanded the Senate. He gave land to veterans and provided entertainment for the masses. Rome buzzed with activity, construction, and renewal. To many, it seemed as though Caesar had solved the Republic's chaos with a firm hand, but to others, he was a tyrant in all but name. The title of dictator for life was too much for Rome's old guard to accept. They had watched Caesar collect honors, statues, and titles with growing unease. Some whispered that he aimed to be king, a word that still stank of Rome's earliest hatred. The Republic had overthrown its kings centuries before, and the very idea of monarchy was poison. Yet here was Caesar, sitting on a gilded chair, wearing laurel crowns, adored by crowds, acting every bit the monarch. A conspiracy formed. Senators, some motivated by principle, others by jealousy, gathered in secret. They called themselves the Liberators, and their leader was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar considered almost like a son. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, they struck. As Caesar entered the Senate chamber, the conspirators surrounded him. Knives flashed, and Caesar fell beneath a storm of blades. Legend says his last words were to Brutus, "You too, my child." Whether he said them or not, the betrayal was real. The man who had risen higher than any Roman before him was left bleeding on the marble floor. The conspirators believed they had saved the Republic. Instead, they doomed it. Rome did not rejoice at Caesar's death. It recoiled in shock. But the Fae, people who had loved Caesar, rioted. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally, seized the moment with a fiery funeral speech that turned public anger against the assassins. Brutus and his fellow conspirators fled, but there would be no peace. Once again, Rome spiraled into civil war. This time, the struggle would not end with compromise. Caesar's legacy lived on, not only in his reforms, but in the men who claimed to inherit his mantle. Chief among them was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, a young man barely 20, but with a cunning mind and relentless ambition. Alongside Antony and Lepidus, he formed the Second Triumvirate, a new power block that hunted down Caesar's killers and crushed them in battle. Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, died by their own hands after defeat at Philippi. The dream of reviving the Republic died with them. Rome was no longer a republic in spirit, if it ever truly had been. It was a battlefield, and the prize was absolute power. The triumvirate soon fractured, as all alliances in Rome eventually did. Antony allied with Cleopatra, while Octavian portrayed himself as the defender of Rome against foreign corruption. Their rivalry climaxed at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they took their own lives, leaving Octavian alone at the top. In 27 BCE, Octavian took a new name, Augustus. He did not call himself king nor dictator. Instead, he wrapped his power in the language of tradition, princeps, the first citizen. But everyone knew what he was. The Republic was gone. In its place stood the Roman Empire, with Augustus as its first emperor. The story of the Republic's fall was complete. It had begun with farmers and citizen soldiers, with senators debating, in the forum, with ideals of shared power and civic duty. It ended with armies loyal to generals, with blood on the marble, with one man holding all authority. The Roman Empire would endure for centuries, reshaping the world, but its birth was soaked in betrayal, ambition, and war. Rome had conquered the world, but in the end, it could not conquer itself.